Now, this morning, we're going to finish up. Last week, we started with the voices at Easter. And there's a lot of voices we hear at Easter time. We think of Easter so often, we just think of the cross, right? We think of Jesus, and he's the main character in the story. And that's good that we think of Jesus, but there's so many other voices that can be heard. And last week, we talked about the voices in the crowd, which were the Pharisees. And this week, we're going to talk about the soldiers. We don't often think about the soldiers, right? Because they're not believers. They're not, they're just kind of appendages to the story. They're just kind of there. But when we look at their story, there's a lot more to them. In fact, we're going to see them from fear to faith. That's the story of the soldiers. The resurrection morning is filled with familiar voices. We hear the voices of women who came to the tomb. We love that story. And there's a lot of preachers preaching this morning. And there's a lot of, you've seen them, there'll be a lot of productions this morning where Jesus comes out of the tomb, right? There's even some, we talked about doing this, but not very seriously. But we even talked about having Dakota be Jesus. And we would have him come out, and then we would raise him up through the ceiling. Have you seen that before? Yeah, but I think our insurance wouldn't cover that, and Dakota was happy about that. So we decided not to do that. But you hear about, the women who came to the tomb in the morning. They went to the tomb, and they're aghast. There's nobody here, right? We hear the stories of the disciples running to the tomb, right? Peter and John running to the tomb. We hear the story of Thomas, who like us, had a lot of questions. What do you mean? The tomb's empty. Well, until I can see him and touch him, I'm not going to believe what you're saying, right? Stories of Thomas and the questions he asked, and Jesus answering his questions with grace. But there's another group of witnesses that we often overlook, and that's the Roman soldiers. Yeah, the Roman soldiers. These men were not followers of Jesus. These men were not seekers. These were not religious men. These were not men that had been longing for millennia to see the promised Messiah that the Old Testament talked about. That wasn't. In fact, these people were executioners. That was their job, to kill people, right? They were trained to crush rebellions. They were trained to carry out death sentences. Crucifixion was their profession, right? What do you do for a living? Crucify people on the cross. They nailed hundreds of men. Think about this. They nailed hundreds of men to the crosses. They heard the screams. They watched the suffering and stood guard while life drained from human bodies. Some of you need to stop complaining about your jobs, right? Stop complaining about your boss. Can you imagine their boss? To them, crucifixion was routine. It was just another Friday, just another criminal. But this execution was different. Something happened at the cross that shook them, and something happened at the tomb that terrified them. These soldiers, these men who represented the greatest military power on earth, Rome ruled with an iron fist. And that day they came face to face with a power far greater than Rome. And in their minds, there was nothing greater than the power that Rome wielded. At the cross, they saw the darkness of judgment. At the tomb, they saw the glory of resurrection. And their story forces us to ask a question this Easter morning. What happens when people who never expect to encounter God suddenly come face to face with him? Because that still happens today. People who never thought about Jesus suddenly encounter him. People who thought Christianity was irrelevant suddenly feel conviction in their hearts. People who never opened a Bible suddenly hear the voice of God. See, Easter has a way of confronting people. And the Roman soldiers remind us that when you encounter the cross and the empty tomb, you cannot stay the same. So let's look at some things about the Roman soldiers. First is this. At the cross, they saw the darkness of judgment. Matthew 27:45-54. I won't take time to read the whole thing this morning, but it says, from noon until 3 p.m, darkness came over the earth. About 3 p.m, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? It goes on to say that some thought he was calling Elijah. One of the soldiers went and got some vinegar, thought he was thirsty, thought he wanted some water, and they offered it to Jesus to drink. And other people said, leave him alone. Let's see if Elijah comes to save him. They were mocking him, right? And it says, when Jesus cried out in verse 50, again in a loud voice, he gave up his spirit. At that moment, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom, which was symbolic of the throne room being opened for us to enter in. It says, the earth shook, the rocks split, and the tombs broke open. And if you skip down to the end, it says, when the centurion and those, in verse 54, when the centurion and those with him who were guarding Jesus saw the earthquake and all that had happened, they were terrified and exclaimed, surely he was the Son of God. See, Matthew tells us something extraordinary happened that afternoon. At noon, the sky turned black. It got dark. For 3 hours, darkness covered the land. These soldiers had seen men die before. That was their job. But they had never seen creation itself respond to a crucifixion. The earth shook, the ground rumbled, rocks split apart, the veil was torn in two, and Jesus cried out with a loud voice before giving up his spirit. This was not a normal death. This was not a defeated man. Something supernatural was happening. Standing there at the foot of the cross, one Roman centurion looked up and said, surely this is the Son of God. Think about that moment. The first clear confession of Jesus at his crucifixion did not come from a disciple. It came from a Roman executioner. The cross broke through the hardness of that soldier's heart, and it still does that today. People come to Christ in hospital rooms realizing that life is fragile. People come to Christ at funerals realizing that eternity is real. People come to Christ in moments when the darkness of life makes them search for light. The cross has a way of awakening hearts because the cross reveals something we cannot ignore, that sin is real, that judgment is real, but grace, amazing grace, is real too. See, the soldiers saw the darkness, but that wasn't the end of the story. How many of you are glad that when bad things are happening in your life? And listen, the last week or so for Tiff and I have been like, you ever had those weeks where it's like one bad thing after another? Not devastating, but just like it's a cycle, right? Oh, man, so all these things are happening, all these things are going on, and wake up Friday morning, and the fridge decides that it's done living. You ever had that moment? So I experienced death on Friday, the death of my fridge. And in case you haven't bought a new fridge lately, they're not cheap, right? But here's the thing. That's not the end of the story. Because in spite of all those things happening, God has done so many miracles. We're making lists of what God's doing in spite of what the enemy's trying to bring, right? And I'm glad that with God, that is not the end of the story. The darkness, not the end of the story. So at the cross, they saw the darkness judgment. The second thing is, at the tomb, they saw the glory of God. Matthew 28, verses 1 to 4 says this, after Sabbath, the dawn of the first day of the week, which would be Sunday, that's why we celebrate the resurrection. We celebrate church. We come to church on Sunday. It's the first day of the week. It's the Lord's day, right? Sabbath is Saturday. And it tells us here, after the Sabbath, after Saturday, the dawn of the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to look at the tomb. There was a violent earthquake, another earthquake, right, at the cross. And now it says, and the angel of the Lord came down from heaven and going to the tomb, rolled back the stone and sat on it. His appearance was like lightning and his clothes were white as snow. The guards were so afraid of him that they shook and became like dead men. 3 days later, some of these soldiers may have been the same soldiers. They're guarding the tomb. They're given another assignment. And the religious leaders, now think about this. The religious leaders, we talked about them last week, the Pharisees, right? The religious leaders were so afraid that the disciples were going to come and steal the body of Jesus so they could tell everybody that he would rise again, that they went to Pilate and told him. And Pilate sent Roman guards to secure the grave. That's how afraid they were of him. A seal was then placed on the stone so that nobody could go in at all. The tomb was guarded. The message was clear. No one gets in. No one comes out. But I love it. We talked about this on Friday, right? It was Friday, but Sunday's on the way, right? It was Sunday morning. Something's about to happen, right? So Sunday morning, something happened that no army, even the greatest army in the history of the world, the Roman army, there was something that happened Sunday morning that no army could stop. Matthew tells us that a violent earthquake shook the ground. See, all creation, at the crucifixion, all creation groaned. And then at the resurrection, the earth shook. An angel descended from heaven. And he rolls away the stone. His appearance was like lightning. And the soldiers, remember, these are trained warriors who feared nothing. They feared nothing. They collapsed like dead men. The men who, think about this, I want you to get this. The men who guarded death were overwhelmed by life. The men who guarded death were overwhelmed by life. The resurrection was not quiet. The resurrection was not subtle. It shook the earth. And it shook the hearts of the soldiers who witnessed it. Because resurrection power is overwhelming. And it still is today. People who feel spiritually dead suddenly come alive. People who were trapped in addiction suddenly experience freedom. People who were hopeless suddenly discover that there is hope in Christ. See, the resurrection is not just an historical event. It is the power of God breaking into human lives. And the soldiers saw it with their own eyes. So we see at the cross, they saw the darkness of judgment. We see at the tomb, they saw the glory of God. The third thing is at the tomb, they faced a choice. Matthew 28, in the same chapter, a few verses later, starting with 11, it says, while the women were on their way, some of the guards, some of them, right, the same guards, some of the guards went into the city and reported to the chief priests everything that had happened. When the chief priests met with the elders and they devised a plan, they gave the soldiers a large sum of money, telling them, you are to say, his disciples came during the night and stole him away while you were asleep. If this report gets to the governor, we will satisfy him and keep you out of trouble. So the soldiers took the money and did as they were instructed, and this story has been widely circulated among the Jews to this very day. What a crazy story. They didn't go to the Roman right after this happened. The soldiers who were Roman didn't go to their supervisors. They went to the religious leaders. And the religious leaders said, we're going to give you money for you to lie. And then if the governor says anything, we'll protect you. We got your back. I don't know. Lying, what is it that your mama told you growing up? Always tell the truth. Benjamin Franklin, I believe, said, always tell the truth and you never have to remember anything. Right? The only time you have to remember things is when you lie, because you got to remember your lie, because you're going to make the lie and then tell another lie, and then the lie gets really big. Just tell the truth. You don't have to remember anything you said. They were told lie. After the resurrection, they reported what happened, right? The religious leaders panicked. They panicked. This is their worst thing that could happen to them, because they really thought the disciples had come taking him. And so they were going to figure out, hey, we got to figure out what we're going to do here. They panicked. They did something shocking think about this. Imagine going to your pastor about a situation and your pastor encourages you to lie. What would you think? You'd be like, I'm finding another church next week. The religious leaders of my church is encouraging me to lie. That's what happened in this story. They were lying. But think about this. The soldiers had seen the truth. They were there when the earth shook. They were there when this light, like lightning flashed, right? And there's this angel, and the angel by himself is moving the stone and sits on it. They were there. They saw the truth. But when they were offered money to deny it, and some of them took it, they saw the truth and still lied about it. Why? Because telling the truth could cost them everything. Telling the truth could cost them their reputation. It could cost them their safety. It could cost them their careers. It could cost them their family. It could cost them everything. And that same tension still exists today. Many people know the truth about Jesus. They know he's real. They know he's Lord. They experience him. They come to church, they experience God. Because God's a God that's to be experienced. It's not that we don't say he was risen, do we? I mean, he was risen. That's an actual event that happened. What we say is he is risen. Why? Because he is every day. He's still risen in our lives. He's still alive. It's an active faith that we live out. And we experience that. And many people have experienced God. But confessing him publicly might cost them something. It might cost them their popularity. It might cost them their comfort. It might cost them their reputation. It might cost them their job. So they stay silent. But Easter does not allow neutrality. The resurrection demands a response. Truth or denial, faith or avoidance, worship or indifference, the soldiers had to decide. And so do we. And the last thing this morning is the soldiers reveal the lordship of Jesus over all. The soldiers reveal the lordship of Jesus. Philippians 2, 9-11, Paul writes this. It says, therefore God exalted him to the highest place and gave him the name that is above every name, that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow, every tongue confess on heaven and earth that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. There's one more powerful truth in this story with the soldiers. These soldiers represented Rome. They were emissaries of Rome, right? When people saw the Roman garb, the soldiers, they knew that they represented Rome. They knew that these soldiers had the power to do whatever Rome felt needed to be done, right? And in Roman culture at this time, Caesar was considered God. He was a God figure. So Caesar was Lord. Your allegiance was to Caesar, first and only. But on that day, even Roman soldiers trembled before Jesus. The empire that thought it had the power of life and death discovered something greater. Jesus was not just another man. He was not just another victim. He was not just another teacher. He was the Son of God. And the resurrection proved it. The cross showed his sacrifice. The resurrection revealed his authority. One day, every knee will bow. Kings will bow, rulers will bow, religious leaders will bow, soldiers will bow. Every nation, every tongue, every person will confess that Jesus is Lord. So how do we finish this morning? See, the Roman soldiers, they stand as unexpected witnesses to the greatest event in history. You ever been to maybe been to a sporting event, or you've been to some place and something amazing happens that like never happened? Maybe we went to a baseball game one time, and man, the pitcher gets to baseball fans, pitcher gets to the ninth inning. There's one out, and there's a no hitter, and you're freaking out, like I'm at this game, right? And then the guy gets a hit, next guy gets a 2-run homer, and then you end up losing the game. Yeah, I was at a game like that, right? 2 outs away from a no hitter, and then we end up losing the game. But it's like, it's unexpected. I mean, you bought a ticket, but it's like, oh my goodness, right? Or you go someplace and something unexpected happens, and you weren't, they don't sell tickets. Hey, something great's going to happen today, so we're selling tickets for that. It doesn't happen like that. The Roman soldiers were unexpected witnesses to the greatest event in history. They saw the darkness of the cross. They saw the glory of the tomb. They felt the earth shake beneath their feet, not once, but twice. They saw the stone being rolled away by an angel that looked like lightning. They heard the angel speak. They knew something supernatural had happened. And the resurrection forced them to make a decision. We know that some confessed the truth and others covered it up. And Easter still confronts people the same way today. Listen, you cannot stand at the foot of the cross and remain unchanged. You cannot look into an empty tomb and stay neutral. The resurrection demands a response. Will you walk away like the soldiers who accepted the lie, or will you fall before the risen Christ like the centurion who declare truly, this is the Son of God. Because Easter is not just a celebration of something that happened a long time ago. It's an invitation. It's an invitation to believe. It's an invitation to surrender. It's an invitation to experience the power of the risen Christ in your life. Easter wasn't an event that happened a long time ago. That's a historical fact. Easter is something that happens for the believer every single day. Every time we get up in the morning, He is alive. Why? Because He's living in us. Easter is not just a one-time event. See, the tomb, the empty tomb today still speaks to us. It declares this: sin has been defeated. That's pretty good. That's a pretty good line. That's a good amen line there. Especially those of us who've been forgiven our sin. The empty tomb still speaks to us and declares that sin is defeated. If you're struggling with sin today, you need to know that sin has been defeated. It's been defeated. Death has been conquered. You know, we lose loved ones. We've lost loved ones. My mom recently went home. We'll be a couple weeks celebrating her memorial service. And death's conquered. I miss my mom. Right? Anybody miss their mom? Because your mom's gone. She's home with Jesus. But we know because of Jesus' death and resurrection that one day we'll see them again. That's conquering death. We know that because of the resurrection, hope, right? Hope has been restored to humanity. There is now a way to receive salvation. There's now a way for us to be in right standing with God. There's hope once again because of the resurrection. And we know this: Jesus is still alive. Jesus is still alive. And He still lives today. And the only question that remains is the same one that those soldiers had to answer. What will you do with the risen King? Would you stand with me this morning?